Welcome, everybody. I'm Dot Butler for the Winchester Coalition for a Safer Community. Tonight we're doing a program on nutrition and athletes. We have Russell Kennedy from Walden Behavioral Health here to make the presentation. It will be run often enough on WinCam, so we welcome you, and turn it over to you.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Okay.
Great to see everybody. I'm Russ Kennedy, and I work at Walden Behavioral Care, which is a set of eating disorder clinics, and we even have an eating disorder hospital in Dedham. It has about 100 beds there, and then we've got clinics all about and some virtual stuff. But one of the programs I run is called Goals, and it's an eating disorder program for athletes. And what I want to do today, and of course when Dot called me and talked about the discussion, she didn't want me just to come in flailing about eating disorders. She wanted me to kind of more talk about like healthy living and how to look at the whole process for our athletes, and then kind of finish off with eating disorders. So that's kind of be how we'll talk about it. And you'll have to excuse me, there was no clicker. But so, I want to start talking a little bit about the nourished mind. And some of us started talking about it a little bit earlier, but we'll go back over it a little bit. And then what I call like a nourished environment. So like what it's like for coaches, what it's like for teammates, what it's like to be a sport parent. And I share some of the theory that they use a lot in sports psychology. I use a lot when I work with coaches on like just the best ways to really get the most motivation and just the most out of your athletes in general. And then I'll jump into the nourished body. And so there's some of the handouts over there on the athletic plate, so what the athlete would eat. And there's kind of the, game day and training hard day. And then there's a moderate day. And then there's like for rest days. And so that'll give you some. Normally I'll be here with a nutritionist, but I was unable to get my nutritionist to make it out today. So I might do a little bit on technical nutrition, especially with the nutritionist in the audience. But talk a little bit more big picture about what we do and how we kind of work with these athletes to kind of help them get through. And at any time, if anyone has a question, let me know, because I think we're at a place where we could have a discussion here, and it might be better to make it a little more custom fit to the people that are here. But the Surgeon General had recently come out, and some of you may have read this, with a report that just really talked about an increase in mental health symptoms. And it's funny because if you look at a lot of the data, they show a very level anxiety, depression, suicidality, year to year for a long time. It's very stable for decades. And then in the early 2000s, around 2010, there was just a huge uptick. And by the way, if we were to ask you all what happened around 2010, you would say, begins with an S and rhymes with social media. And so that's when social media was on your hip. And I think that's when it really started changing a lot of the, developing minds, because it really changed how they saw themselves. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. There's some really cool social psychologists, and we can talk about too if you have any questions. There's some cool books I can share with you too. But just to show you, and so these are some of these kids are just graduating college now. Increases of sadness, hopelessness, considering attempting suicide or planning. Huge increases from millennials to Gen Zs. And a lot of it is there's a couple people, Haidt and Twenge, really explore some of the social trends. And they talked about cable news in the 80s, that's when it really kind of started. And there was also a crime wave from the 70s and 80s. If anyone's as old as I am, they'll know there was like a movie called Escape from New York, because New York was so high in crime, there was this idea that, and then you had cable news to say, let's share this with you 24/7. And then when they shared that with us, we really started scaring the bejesus out of parents. When I was in school, there was no school shootings. I didn't have any worry. It wasn't even a thought that could happen. And it wasn't until these more later generations that became very, very common. But, think of this theme, right? Cable news brings 24/7 news, so this nonstop, to our parents. And now our parents start to change their parenting behaviors. And we see things like, when I was younger, my dad used to say it all the time, I need to prepare you for the road ahead of you. Well, now parents started trying to make the road easier for their kid. They started trying to prepare the road for the kid rather than the kid for the road. And what we find, especially with like social media, is just huge differences in how it affects our young boys and our young girls. Huge. Boys use their phones mostly for gaming. They said even if it's violent gaming, like killing things and people, they say it actually has a lot of benefits to it. Not as dangerous as our parents told us when we were all growing up. They actually find positive for some parts of brain growth. And we also understand that a lot of guys, we think of guys being more violent, but young boys and young girls in research are equally violent. They just express their violence differently. So we all know for boys, violence might be much more physical, where for girls, our violence is much more relational. You and I are fighting. I'm going to talk smack about you behind your back. I'm going to let someone know that secret that you told me not to tell anybody. And now you can see that what had happened to our parents with cable news, the 24/7, happened to their kids with social media 24/7, except the news they're getting is their own personal feed. So they're not just learning about other things in the world. So these things change. We talk about a nourished mind. These things really changed the expression of mental health in our kids. And this is a pretty cool book, Nassim Taleb, called Anti-Fragile. He's trying to think of what do we talk about when we want to make an environment to help our kids grow stronger. It's more than just resilient. We think of resilience as bouncing back. But anti-fragile is more than that. Anti-fragile says we should bounce back stronger. So think of breaking a bone, which I have, and I think many of your athletes probably have too. We know that bone grows back stronger in the area that it was broke than it was previously. So we would say that our skeletal muscular system. Another area of anti-fragility is immune system. That was something we found out with peanut allergies. They found that peanut allergies only existed in countries where obstetricians told women to stop eating peanuts. Isn't that brilliant? Have you read any of that stuff? Absolutely brilliant. And then they did a whole study, it was out of Israel, where they would take kids that were most likely going to be allergic and they would give them this little snack that had peanut dust, sprayed on it, and they found a huge, huge, huge difference when that exposure, the hygiene, what they call it. So now they think there might be something similar with our mental health and our mental well-being, similar to our immune system, where we need stresses in order for us to grow, to be effective when we're adults. And I think that sports, as a high schooler and a middle schooler, is a brilliant vehicle for that kind of positive development, if we do it right. But what you'll hear me talk about a little bit more as we go is that our culture doesn't always do it super right. So when we talk about nourishing the mind, I want to talk a little bit about kind of the most up-to-date research on emotions, just so we can all kind of launch from the same place. And then talk a little bit about some of the stuff that they do in sports psychology with when I talk to the kids, kind of the attitude I want them to bring to the gym, and they have different kind of these little acronyms and things they use for the athletes. I'll talk a little bit about that. Psychological flexibility is another concept that I want you all to know about. And the minds we'll talk about when I get there. It's just stuff that when I work with these athletes to kind of help their minds as they go. And I'm sure you've heard of the 3 minds, right? We'll talk about it from DBT if you've done any of that with your training. And then everyone has been talking about the growth mindset, so I'll just touch on it a little bit, but kind of the power of yet and kind of that. So this would be for our nourished mind, and jump in at any time, questions, concerns, complaints, and push back at any time. I love it. I pay extra. So this here is what I want us to understand. This is how modern neuroscience looks at emotions and what our emotions are. William James back in 1904 was right. He said that our emotions stem from physiology. Physiological experience occurs in my body, and then through my belief and my history, I kind of interpret the context to the emotion. So if I asked all of you, my heart is beating fast, my palms are sweaty, what emotion am I? Could be, right? What else could it be? Scared, right? Disappointed, frightened. So now you can see that it's the context reads my physiology. And the reason I bring this up is because what other than sleep and eating and drinking is going to affect your internal physiology in such a regular, supposedly a regular pace every day, and to have such a huge shift in your emotions. Hangry is a real thing. And so when our nourishment is off, or if our sleep is off, that plays into an inner physiology that I'm going to read through this lens. And the reason I also tell you this is when I talk about eating disorders, especially a restrictive eating disorder, where someone's not eating or drinking a lot, that nourishment can mimic other physiology for other emotions. So if I told you like that someone hadn't drank enough fluid and now they have a lower blood volume, which happens to a lot of our people with anorexia, and if I have any kind of closed system and there's less fluid, the pump moving that has to go faster. So now, just for the fact of being restricted and not having enough fluid or not having enough salts and electrolytes, that now their cardiovascular system has to pump faster to get that to work. Well, if I all asked you now what kind of physiology stems from a heart beating fast, we realize there's a whole slew of things now that it could be. So you could see why about 80% of the people in my clinic have a coexisting diagnosis of anxiety or OCD or depression. That's the one thing about my clinic with my interns. We have about 6 interns in a clinic. I've got a couple for the goals program. And I kind of tell them, I'm like, you're working with eating disorders, but you're going to see everything. You know, we have people with DIDs, with a multiple personality, and from all backgrounds too. It isn't just a wealthy person disease. So, when we talk about the state of mind that I want the kids in, is that what I'm really trying to teach them is when they come to practice, when they come to the gym, I want to teach them this skill of leaving homework and concerns outside of the gym and focusing on what's at hand in the gym or the studio or wherever they're practicing. So I want them to be super present. So they call it POD. Be present, be open, and do what matters. And what I'm really trying to teach them is this way to kind of focus their minds and kind of compartmentalize that this is my task at hand, even though I've got homework in another class, and even though my boyfriend or girlfriend or my mom or dad or my sister is bothering me, I have to learn how to kind of like exercise my brain so I can kind of like separate and compartmentalize things so I can get things done. So when I work with athletes, I say this is really a big piece of this. Most of you aren't going to be pro athletes, a couple of you, but with the rest of you, I want you to learn skills that are going to help you when you're at work, when you're in relationships, if you're a parent, and to be a good friend. And it's really kind of learning how to live a life that has you lean into your values and kind of away from your insecurities. And so this is a big part of in the athletic research for for performance enhancement and getting kids to be more focused is really kind of to teach that kind of attitude when they're in the gym. And it changes a lot for a lot of kids that we can talk about as we go further. But another piece to kind of keep in mind is I also want kids to kind of learn how to shut off again, right? How to not be thinking of things. You know, the dog has got the right attitude in this situation. Really learning how to shut off, where here they have the same view, but the human, of course, is thinking about all these other things. And I think this also leads to difficulties in our moods, in our mental wellness, in our relationships. And so, one of the other equations I tell a lot of our clients, I say, your nourishment is going to play into those emotions. And then those emotions are going to play into your relationships. So once you mess with your nourishment, you ultimately mess with your relationships. And that's when I see people, when I have kids come there, it's because their parents, their coach, someone else is saying something is going wrong. It isn't always, or rarely is it the athlete. Right now, when it comes to the different kinds of psychology, psychological flexibility is also seen as just psychological wellness, being happy and healthy. And it's defined as the ability to persist or change a behavior to stay in the service of a value. And think of someone in substance abuse. So I wanna cease a behavior or change a behavior. I don't wanna drink or smoke or inject or whatever I'm doing because I wanna be a good dad. And so the value that I lean into is really the motor and the engine that's going to get me to kind of change my behaviors. And so this is really big now because I get these kids that are incredibly perfectionistic, incredibly focused, and it gets them great grades, and everyone praises them for that focus. And they're always put together amazingly well, and when everyone sees them, they get praised for this Look at how put together you are. And then other areas of their lives, maybe in music, in art, you'll see this place where this kind of focus can be so beneficial. But quite often, it'll really go sour with some of our kids when it comes to their nourishment. And getting them to persist or change behaviors really ends up being very difficult. Because what I find most often when I talk to these kids, and they talk about their size and shape and why they do some of these eating disorder behaviors, it often comes down to a certain value. And what value do you think it is that gets these kids to do these behaviors that might be unhealthy? What kind of value do you think they'll give me when I ask them? Like, what's motivating that behavior? What do you think they would say? What would motivate a kid to want to be smaller in size?
Well, a lot of times perfectionism.
Perfection is a huge one. But again, like, why is that perfect? Why is small perfect?
Social media image.
So again, it's this idea that we have this social understanding, and when study after study, when they ask people what they think is attractive, not everyone is pointing to one silhouette. They point to a whole myriad of sizes and shapes. So as humans, we really don't have that, but most kids will tell me the value that they're doing is to be smaller bodied. And it wasn't until the 1930s that eating disorders was linked to body size. Can you guess what it was linked to before the 1930s? And there's documentation for anorexia that goes back hundreds of years. A couple of saints. Oh, I gave a hint. Yes, from fasting. It was about religious piety. If I could fast longer than you, I was more pious than you, I got a better seat in heaven or something. I don't know how that works. But that really led to this big issue. And there were a couple of saints that would read their diaries and found out that they saw their ability to not eat as something that was a holy piety. And so what I'm really trying to do is to get kids to really isolate and understand their values, and that when you're in sports, you're exercising those values, whether it be working hard, problem solving, or teamwork, that this is a vehicle for me to learn these things, and that I can start exercising other values. Because in my training, I also worked in hospice. So I've worked with like kids and younger kids, and then I started working with older people as they were passing. And the people that were passing and then weren't really in such dire straits when it came to their mental health were the ones who still could lean into their values, still had something to grow on. There was a famous book called The Blue Zones. I'm sure you probably read it, or it's a pretty famous book, and it was about these epidemiologists that studied where in the world people were living past 100 regularly. And so places like Okinawa was one of these places. And what they did is they circled all these different areas. I think Roscommon, Ireland, where my family is from, was one of those areas. And they circled them all with blue pen. So they said, oh, these blue zones, people are living in a way that's making them live extra long. And in Okinawa, they said that one of the things that got people to live so long was a term ikigai, which means reason for living. And so people that had value, had reasons, had connections were the people that would live longer. And Ellen Langer from Harvard University had some really cool studies when she went to homes for the elderly, and she would give certain floors a plant, and other floors didn't get that. And they would say just simple watering instructions and plant food. And that alone, the plant, was changing mortality rates. Just giving them something to connect with, something to feel. So I'm trying to use sports as another vehicle for these kids to start that process. Again, using sports as a vehicle for positive development as they get older. And so I also love this a Tanzanian proverb: the wind does not break a tree that bends. And just like an athlete, as a gymnast like myself, and Winchester has a great gymnastics program, a great cheerleading program. In fact, their coach, Candice Lentini, was one of my athletes. She's a great person. Yeah, Candice is wonderful. But I want to start, telling them, just like physical flexibility helps you as an athlete, it makes you more limber, less likely to get injured. I would say that psychological flexibility does the same thing for you with mental illness. So it is going to make you more limber. It's going to make you move faster amongst emotions and situations. And it's going to make it less likely for you to get injured. And again, these are things that I want coaches to be exercising in these environments where they're working with their kids. So in my clinics, when I work with kids and adults, I usually get two kind of categories of people. People that are too impulsive, my binge eaters, are the people that I usually are impulsive. So they get to a point where they can't stop, they feel out of control. And so when I have impulsive people, I remind them, and this is some of the stuff I'd like the kids to learn, is that, when we look at our mind, we kind of have this Venn diagram of a very emotional part of our mind, a very reasonable part of our mind, and when we use both of them, we've got this, what we call the wise mind. And a lot of my impulsive clients are acting on that emotional hut kind of mind. And I think we all know people like that have kind of almost like, no filter when they think something, they say something, and they have that impulsive. Or maybe you have a friend that sometimes when you go out partying, you're like, they're really impulsive, some of the stuff they're going to end up saying or doing or whatnot. And then later on, when you get the reasonable mind, you're like, I can't believe you did that. And then their wise mind says, yeah, I guess sober me wouldn't do something like that. So I'm trying to teach them, without such an analogy, of course, that this is going to happen to a lot of them when they're impulsive. And I want them to be able to stop for a moment and see if we can engage the part of the mind that's not working. And this I find a lot with my young women. And again, going back to emotions, going back to middle school and high school athletes, and think of all the changes in their physiology. Despite a really hard physical, routine with their sport, that's changing physiology constantly, they're developing and growing, and hormones are changing, and they're learning about themselves. So they don't even have that history with a lot of those physiology changes to understand what a lot of that means. So you can see why we have, when you ask people the worst years of their lives, they say middle school. And it's usually when most people are starting to go through those physiology changes. And again, once physiology changes, it changes my emotion. And when my emotions are changed, it changes my relationships. And it's usually that change in the relationships that really makes it difficult for people. So a lot of athletes get stuck in emotional mind. Think of the basketball player that's missing free throws. They get very emotional about it. They start thinking, if I miss this again, it's going to kill my numbers, and the news is going to say this, and my coach is going to bench me. And they start getting this very emotional place. And then the reasonable mind would come in and say, this is the same shot you've done a million times. And then you can find that wise mind in the middle. All right? And then, as we know, a lot of adolescents aren't adept at emotional regulation. So this ends up being really difficult. And then sometimes I tell coaches and parents that their kids might need some emotional spotting. And as a gymnast, that's kind of a term we use all the time, right? Like, let's help them. In gymnastics, when I tell coaches, I'm trying to get more and more coaches to get their hands off their kids. And I say, we spot when someone's going to get hurt. They're going to fall on their head, I want you to catch them. But if they're going to fall on their feet and then go to their knees and then go to their head, I'm kind of okay with that one. That's a stress they can live, and it keeps them more autonomous, your hands off them. It's a better situation for everybody. So with emotional spotting, especially for my young boys who don't always find it socially acceptable to really venture into an emotional world, especially at those ages, sometimes I remind them, looks like you seem really frustrated. That seems to really get you angry. Sometimes allowing people, or usually the boys, they know when they're angry. But sometimes they're frustrated and not angry, and then I have to be like, we got to paint this a little different. So it opens up some dialogue. So I feel for coaches, I say the same thing. If you're catching your kid there, give them a little emotional spot, and you're frustrated right now, so we got to take care of that first. Then we can go back and see if we can fix this problem. Again, trying to set them up for skill set that's going to benefit them when, especially in college and in the world afterwards when they're in their careers. But not all my athletes are impulsive. Some of mine are perfectionists. And so there's a there's a type of therapy called dialectical behavioral therapy, or DBT. And that's the impulsive person. And that's where a lot of that work with impulsivity comes from DBT. And then there's a whole other section called radically open DBT, RODBT, and that's for our perfectionists. And my perfectionists are stuck in unmovable and serious. A lot of coaches love that. A lot of parents love that. That means homework is done. Piano lessons are paid for because the kid is practicing. And they really start to develop a way of living where they're not really acquiescing. They're not bendable. They're not even open sometimes to criticisms, especially if there's a criticism that is against what they think. so that really locks them in. And also, they're just not that playful. When that one researcher that was studying indigenous cultures in New Zealand was talking about how much more they laughed than Western culture. He said they laughed all the time. He said they laughed during like rainstorms when someone's tent got blown over. Everyone laughed. And he said the person laughing the hardest was the person whose tent was blown over. I said it would be the opposite if it was Western culture, right? And it's funny because he interviewed that guy whose tent got blown over and everyone was laughing. He asked him, why are you laughing? And he goes, I was made for this environment. Anything it dishes to me, I can handle. Why not laugh? I was like, man, can you imagine if our kids were saying that about navigating Western culture? But remember, the Western culture they're being raised in is not the Western culture any of us were raised in. When I grew up, I could go to my dad and say, hey, Dad, can you help me with algebra? Because it was the same algebra that he grew up in. My kid comes to me and asks me questions about his phone. I just look at him and be like, you're kidding, right? Like, I can't help you with that stuff. And if anyone knows, we worked to get my computer on this screen. It took some very intelligent people a long time. There's a very different world that we live in. And this is also for parents to remind yourself that, you have to help your kid get more flexible. They need to hear it. They need that stress. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in that kind of hygiene. And then have you heard about mindset, fixed and growth? It's just a real big buzzword nowadays. I call it the power of yet. That's my right arm, by the way. That's my metal right arm that I almost lost as a gymnast. When I was at Syracuse in college, I wrapped my arm around the high bar and I almost had it amputated. But now it's all metal. And spoiler alert, it's still here. I still have my arm. They didn't take it, but they were going to amputate it. I had like 5 operations. But, it took me a good 6 months to move my hand. And the doctor told me I was going to be like Bob Dole. Anyone? Any Bob Dole fans? Not necessarily a fan, but if you remember, he was a war hero, and he hurt his right hand in like a plane crash, and he couldn't shake hands. So he would hold like a pen or something in his right hand during campaign events. So when you went to meet him and you extended your hand, he had an excuse to not shake your hand, and he'd put his left hand out. And my doctors, this was back in 1991. Most of you weren't born, but when this happened, my doctor, and Bob Dole was a common political figure, my doctor told me that I would be like Bob Dole, that I'd be holding a pen in my hand. And so the thing is that, the doctor was trying to give me a fixed mindset. He was basically limiting my ability by telling me what my ability would be. And then that's what they found out when they gave like 5th graders 7th grade math tests. They found there were 2 camps. The kids who said, hey, I'm not in 7th grade, I can't do this. That's a fixed mindset. You have to be in 7th grade to do 7th grade math. But then you had these other kids that had the growth mindset and said, well, we'll see what I can figure out. Do my best. And it was that growth mindset that made the difference. And I think for me, that's why I kind of show this, is because I went from 5 operations where they told me I was going to lose my arm in every one of them to competing the next year. And so for me, it was just really more about having that mindset of, well, let's just see where this goes. So I always tell parents to talk to their kids about the power of the magical word yet. Not yet. Hasn't happened yet. Rather than this yes or no and that kind of solid. And really starting to get your kid to kind of understand that there's some kind of honor in the process of trying, even if you feel you may not succeed. And that's sports, right, in a nutshell. Most of our time is spent failing and screwing up. I like this picture, and I wish there was more of it on there, but you see, obviously, this guy just tried to score and missed, but look at all the people wearing the same color shirt in the same position. And if the picture was bigger, these guys in the opposite shirt are all in the same position as well. And we can see that there's a very physical part of our emotion that kind of is expressed in our physicality, but often it can be shared. So you can have one kid on a team that can set everyone's kind of emotion for that team. And that can be good or bad, as many of you have probably been in that situation. So that kind of transitions us to this like nourishing environment. What kind of environment, what kind of coach, what kind of teammates, and what kind of sport parent, is going to be helpful to make this nourishing environment. And it reminds me of this story that I had read, because I'm always reading history on like how students learn and things. And there was this slang term in Oxford University in the 1830s, and there were these tutors that were just so apt at getting their students to graduation that they used to joke and say it was just like they just put them in a horse-drawn carriage, and the carriage took them to graduation. But as you guys know, they didn't say carriage back then. They said coach. And that's where the term coach came from. But I guess my argument is that maybe putting our kids in a coach is not the right idea. Maybe that kind of protection might be helpful for learning certain aspects of their sport, but maybe it's that exposure to those kind of stresses of the environment that really sculpt their growth. And that's kind of what we were saying with like all the kids that were stuck on Zoom for a year or so. How that really like took away a lot of that exposure to the stresses. I tease my son and I'm like, well, nowadays my single friends just can look for dates on their phone. They don't have to like awkwardly approach somebody at a party or a bar or something, you know. But I think it was that stress that brought the growth in the process. And I think that we are forgetting that by making things so easy that, maybe we're missing the point. So I'm saying maybe in 1830 they want you in a coach. With our kids, I want them in a forge. I want them taking a beating. I want them getting exposed to some heat and having to deal with it. I need them to change their shape, even if they're going to be resistant to it. So that's why I tell coaches they're brave smiths. That your job is to get them to teach them how to do this hard work and patience. And the only way you do that is if you can convince them to be brave enough to do it. And so your job as a coach is really to create an environment that fosters courage, fosters bravery. And then that natural motivation to grow and to master and to succeed is going to take over. And then the coach has really done their job, right? Because I always say to the coach, I'm like, if you're spotting and doing it for them, you're doing your job and their job. And they're not learning how to do their job. Let them wipe out a little bit. Don't let them get hurt. I don't want these kids breaking, but I want them wiping out safely. And I mean that in gymnastics. I mean that in other sports. I mean that in school. I mean that socially. I mean that with your parents. So I want you to kind of keep that in mind. And when we work with teams and when I work with coaches, I really kind of talk to them as in their leadership. And the big theory that's used is Richard Ryan and Ed Deasy. I think it's University of Rochester. And they're brilliant. They're really awesome. Most of their work is on how to get more out of your employees, how to work with employees' motivation. And the self-determination theories, and we're going to look at it backwards because I think it'll make the most sense backwards. I want enhanced performance as a coach, as a parent, as an employer. So I want enhanced performance. I want that to be persistent. I want creativity in what you do. I also want loyalty. But in order for me to get that, I need an environment that's going to foster volition, motivation, and engagement. Engagement's a big word in sports psych. You got to get your athletes engaged in practice. Got to get them engaged into this whole process. And the only way I'm going to have that kind of motivation environment is that if my athlete goes into the gym and experiences some autonomy, he or she has a sense of competence in what they're doing, and they feel connected or related to the journey here. And so I tell coaches, whenever you say something to your athlete and you're giving them an instruction, there's the technical instructions, right? As a gymnast, there's a million things you imagine I could say about the technique of the trick that they're doing. But I find that's a small part of coaching. What I really am trying to do in everything I say to them is use the right amount of autonomy. And when I say that for parents too, is that I'm really trying to navigate them doing enough by themselves where they struggle. And so if the kid's going to land in their head, I take over. I take full control. I catch that kid. I don't want you falling. I don't want you getting hurt. So I take over. They have no autonomy. I'm in control. But other than that, I'm really trying to give them an environment where they can exercise autonomy as best they can. So you'll see a really good coach might be, okay, I want you guys to go over here and do this drill here. I want you two over here working on this thing there. Make it work. Make it work. Work it out. Coach, I don't like working with him. I don't care. Work with him. Make it work. Like, it's that kind of whole aspect of it. So I also, when we have too many coaches that are what I would call deficit-focused coaches, and their athletes do an attempt and they try something, you see this with parents too, and they just tell you everything you did wrong. oh, this is wrong here, your head was here, your legs were this, all these things were wrong. And when I would do a lot of coaching, sometimes I'll work with a kid with a very high level tumbling skill. And they'll try the tumbling skill, but they won't make the full tumbling skill. And they see that as a failure. And I'm like, an awful lot had to go right in order for you to get to that point where you're flipping and flying in the air to try this skill. And if I just look at this binary code of one, did it right or didn't do it right, then I really can lose out on the intricacies that can help my athlete grow. And that's really what my job is. So I really want to make them feel confident in what they're doing. So I tell coaches, there's always things you can comment on, such as effort. I really appreciate how hard it is you've been trying to do this. You've been wiping out left and right trying to get this skill, but you go at it so hard each time. And I think there, even though the kid is not improving in the skill, they start to create a sense of competence. That I was, just like I was saying, like that Aboriginal New Zealander, that they are made for this, that they are perfect for this, that this is a process, that they're at the right place where they're supposed to be in their process. And I just want to focus on the now and the presence of this process. So this is also, when I do these lectures with coaches, I spend more time on this slide right here. How are you talking to your kids to make them feel they're connected? Do they know, coaches know reflective listening? A lot of coaches don't know reflective listening. And I'm like, I want to teach you how to have an interaction with your athletes where they feel heard. Because then they're going to start to feel more and more related, or connected is the word I think is better. They're going to feel connected to this team, to this process, to this sport, and to their teammates. And so really it is that whole idea. I want to feel more connected. I want them to feel like, even though they might not have did their trick or won their game, they don't stink at what they do. I think most of us we're really not motivated to do things if we feel like we're doing them horribly, especially if we think everyone around us is doing them really good. It's very unmotivating. So, and then this is kind of one of their theories, and we can talk a lot more about it because this idea of control really informs their motivation. And there's different theories on motivation. There's one of the big theories of motivation is used a lot in substance abuse. This gentleman named Bill Miller created something called motivational interviewing. I don't know if any of you did it in your studies, but you probably did. But it's a way to kind of work with someone to stoke their motivations. And it talks a lot about motivation being a combination of how important something is, how confident that they are that they can do it. Those are the two major pillars. So if we took cigarette smoking, for example, and we talked to someone about trying to quit cigarette smoking, and we tell this person, you got to quit smoking cigarettes because you're going to get cancer, emphysema, heart disease. Well, what I'm really trying to do is increase the importance of this change to that person, and that'll motivate them more. Thing is that most people don't want cancer, emphysema, or heart disease, so it's already pretty important for them. So when you push importance to someone, when it's already important, you annoy them. They don't want to be around you. They stop listening to you. So I say for parents, I'm like, really? When you see a kid who doesn't seem motivated, you have to ask yourself, is this not important to this kid? Does this kid not realize what doing this homework right here is important, or studying for this test is important? Or are they not confident? Like most smokers, right? Most smokers will say, hey, Russ, I tried quitting. I tried cold turkey. I tried hypnotism. I tried some special gum that people use. I don't know. There's all these different things that you can do. Nothing worked. They're still unmotivated to stop smoking because they have no confidence. They have no belief that they can make the change. So sometimes I want us to think, when we're working with someone who we think is unmotivated, we have to say, really, what is it? Do they have some kind of meaning? So when my anorexic athlete says, no, I need to be under 100 pounds, that's the number that I can't be over. I don't like being triple digits. I got in some trouble one time because this girl had this big thing about she couldn't be triple digits. She had to be 90-something pounds, had to be triple digits. So I told her to switch to metric. She didn't like that. But I was like, that was such a fix. I was like, that really would fix the problem. It didn't work. Interestingly, she's had a 5-year eating disorder, was triggered because she was trying to fit into her wedding gown. And since then, she hasn't had a period. And her husband wanted to have a big family. And as most of you know, that doesn't work. A lot of the people, if they're too restricted, they lose their ability to be fertile. And it can affect them as they get older as well. And it happens a lot even with our athletes, something they used to call the female athlete triad. Now they call it REDS, relative energy deficiency in sports, because it just affects so many other things than just the triad. And then what I kind of say here too is that when you're in there and you're working with your kids, just be very mindful in how you use incentives. There was some really interesting work on incentives that was done. They have something called the candlestick problem. I don't know if anyone's heard of it, but I don't want to bore you too much, but it was interesting because they had this problem where you had to light a candle and you had to stick it to the wall, and they gave you a certain amount of things to do it with. And they had people, they said, okay, I want you to fix this problem. And they told them, figure this out. And they told one group, we want to see how long it takes the average person. And they told the other group, whoever does it fastest gets $1,000. Which group do you think figured it out faster? The norms. 30%. That's legit. In other words, sometimes those incentives take some of that mental focus away from the task and onto the incentive. So whether it's a reward or a punishment, sometimes when we use those incentives as parents or as coaches, we actually set them up for failure, because in a way we're starting to take some of their focus off of the issue at hand. And so with athletes, I say sometimes it's don't think, just do. Push-ups, sit-ups, don't think, just do. But other times I really want to see how do you engage your athletes into this process. So again, just reminding ourselves is that, getting them to feel confident in what they're doing, that they have some sense of mastery, that's a huge aspect in human psychology. Even if you go back to Abraham Maslow, when he used to talk about the hierarchy of need, mastery was up there in the hierarchies of need. In the summer, so as a gymnast and I tumble, I started working with cheerleaders because they would have mental blocks and issues when they would tumble. So I would work with them in their tumbling. And then I started getting, maybe 10 years ago, I started getting invited to lecture at these conferences for all the coaches. So there's a group called the USASF, which is all the cheerleaders. They go to Disney for world championships, and they also have dance competitions. And so when I lecture them, and what they did, they wanted to do some leadership work with their athletes. So I would go to 5 or 6 cities every summer, and they would have athletes from those cities come, and we had this leadership program that we would have them do. And I would ask all the kids, just my own little poll, and I would say, think of all these different kind of traits. We were talking about good traits as a human. What trait do you want more of that you don't have? And I mean, it was ubiquitous. Everywhere I went, if it was the South, the Midwest, and there was mostly girls, because it's cheerleaders, it's 90% plus girls. It was confidence. Confidence. I want more confidence. I need more confidence. When I would work with kids with mental blocks, and I would first just ask them, well, tell me the situation. Tell me where you are. What's going on? And they would look at me and say, I don't have confidence. They had already diagnosed the problem, that it was something in them. And they talk about confidence as if it's currency. Oh, well, let's go get you some confidence. I think the convenience store has some. It's really good, this is one thing. And I remind us, Confidalis, have you ever seen those bumper stickers, Semper Fi for the Marines? Semper Fidalis, always faithful. So confidence comes from that same root word, fidalis, faithfulness. With faith, with faithfulness. So, we really start understanding where we have a generation of kids now who are really struggling with that faith in themselves, with their faith in their own abilities, and with their faith to kind of reproduce what they've done. So it was always interesting is when I was a young gymnast, we used to have this rule of 3s. If you did a trick for the first time, then you would show your friends, and then when you show your coach, you did 3 times, and then it was yours. If you did 3 times in a row, trick was yours. You could do it anytime you wanted. And it totally wasn't true, but that's what we would kind of convince ourselves. But every time I could convince myself, there were a couple tricks on the high bar that I used to do with one hand. And I remember telling my dad, every time I let go of one hand to do it, every single time I expected to go flying off the bar. Every single time. My feelings were this is the one, you're going. And there were times I definitely went. But I always had that feeling. But over time, it really built this confidence that even though I was scared, I still could pull through. Even though I had this fear that could and has happened, that it still pumped up my sense of myself being a competent person. And that's something I'm not seeing a lot with a lot of the athletes. So I'll have kids lose tricks. I don't know if any of you have athletes that have done any kind of gymnastics or cheerleading or tumbling, but they'll say, I used to do a full, but I lost it. which then, of course, I always ask, well, where did you have it last? We should just go there. It's probably there. Did you check your other sweatpants? Like, I really try to annoy them with, like, bad dad jokes, but kind of tell them, like, this is not a tangible thing that we're talking about, you know? And basically, under that logic, every trick that I did as a gymnast, I have lost. Because most of them. I can't really do many of them anymore without, like, serious surgical intervention afterwards. I'd probably break things or whatever. But I don't have that mentality that I lost these things. I've just grown in my life in a different direction. I don't train them anymore. I have a very different way of looking at it. And a lot of our young women especially are kind of struggling in that sense of feeling that assurance in themselves in a good way. And so I often talk about this idea of connection. I want everyone to feel connected. I want coaches to feel connected to their kids and kids to each other, teammates and their parents. And I always remind people, parents parent and coaches coach. But a lot of parents were athletes or coaches, and a lot of coaches were parents. So it's easy for them to want to cross and do each other's jobs. And so I always remind parents, like, if you're at a event, and they've just done tons of studies when they ask the kids, your kid just cares that you're there, that you care enough to be there. They don't need your advice when they're out there running on the field. And so many parents think that their kid is like, my dad loves me more because he told me I should have got that rebound, you know, or something like that, and it just doesn't help. And so I'm really reminding people that, you know, I'm really trying to help us navigate our relationships better. And I want to have a relationship with a coach that can be transferred to a relationship like with a boss, and teammates to be a relationship with like coworkers. So we can really start exercising skills that are going to be helpful down the road. So like parents, like you guys get the kids there, you support them, you prepare them. It's just really about that, getting them to practice, getting them nourished. With eating disorders, with adolescents, family-based therapy is the treatment. We do very little with the kids. It's, all right, Mom and Dad, we're going to show you some skills that we've used and worked with others that can help when you have a kid who kind of runs this way, you know? And so I really want us to kind of understand, like, okay, there's still going to be this role, and for parents, a big part of you of having an athlete, being a sport parent, is making sure they have the nourishment that they need, and that's why we handed out those flyers, just to give you some ideas of things, and to understand that it's not a static thing, that you've got this rigid meal plan, and that I follow this rigid meal plan to the T. Again, you can hear that perfectionism coming in, right? Or what they would call maladaptive over-control, you know? But if I'm having a hard workout, a long run, if I'm a runner, if I have a day where I'm competing, then that nourishment is going to reflect that activity. And if I'm having a rest day, or if I'm at a different place in my training. So I really want us to start to understand that when we look at this whole process, parents' roles here are to really support their kids doing as much on their own. And so I tell coaches that autonomy supportive environment is the one that I want them to create. I want them really having the kids more involved. But when it comes to nourishing your kid, I'm really not that concerned if it's an autonomy supportive environment. When it comes to nourishing your kid, I really want you to take more control over that. You know, one thing I think we're learning with our high schoolers and middle schoolers is that they're not as apt at or adept at understanding and navigating the complex nutritional environment of modern Western culture. It's just not easy. Like, you know, I have a 13-year-old and an 18-year-old, two sons. And when I go out with my son, my 13-year-old, his mom's a nutritionist. So the waitress comes and he says what he wants. When he was a really young kid, the waitress one time asked him how he wanted his burger, and he replied, fresh. Not understanding about that whole well done thing. But, you know, so he does. But when I take out some of his friends after like a soccer game or a hockey game, and it's like nuggets and fries, and they don't even look at the menu. And so there's kind of like, that's why I want to take the parents, like, no, your kid needs more, he needs you to have more control right now. He's got too much control. He hasn't been trained well enough. You know, my kids order sushi. They order what they want at a sushi restaurant. Better than me. But that's how they were raised, to have this really good connection with food. And one thing I feel is that it's just got harder in the more recent generations to navigate. And because of that, I think we have to have tighter control on how. So that's why I said autonomy is, I said appropriate autonomy. I want to, in certain things, leave them alone, do it yourself. Other things, jump in there. They are not ready to make these decisions because look what they do when you give them the option. They haven't learned yet. So a lot of our kids with nourishment, because that's one of the things all the parents tell me. Well, I can't make them eat. I'm like, yeah, you can. Do they have a phone? Yep, take their phone. They will do anything for that thing. But I have to tell them, no, they're still at this phase where they need training. They need you to kind of come in. When I work with coaches, I talk a lot about the autonomy supportive environment, where it really just talks more about how we interact with our kids in a way. So I really focus more on aspects of what they're doing right. I also can be more technical, so I'm not really blaming them. So I can make it a much more scientific kind of process. So again, I'm not trying to make them fragile. I'm trying to make it a very streamlined process because that's what I want for their work environment. I want them to have a job that they know what they're doing, it's clear, it's straight to the point, and that we can have some fun while we do it. And then the same thing I tell parents, I want you to praise process, not product, or I say praise the journey, not the destination. Too many kids could have had a great game, but because the scoreboard said they lost, ruins the rest of their day. But that could have been a day with personal best involved. So I really, I want us to kind of look at things as in it's the process that I want. So when I go, because I always get the question as, someone in my field, what do I say when I go to my kids' sporting events? Like, what do I say to encourage him? And I tell everyone this, I say, I want any kid on the field to hear what I say and think I'm talking to them. Hustle, hustle! There you go, you got it. Like any kid can hear what I'm saying and think that I'm talking to him or her. And so for me, it's just because I really wanted to get it, that it's really about that process. It's not that you have to overcome that person. I just need you to run as fast as you can. That idea, that's a process. And if I can get a kid to start enjoying process, you can really see how effective they become in this society. So they can kind of fall in with the process and not be too product focused. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit more about the body. I just wanted to remind you again, this is what your kids are going through. Nourishment, sleep, think of pain. How many of your kids are coming home in pain? My athletes, I'm amazed how much pain they would come in. Cheerleaders, they call it a dead mat. Gymnasts have a spring floor and has these foam things and springs, and it takes a lot of the oomph when you land. Stopped a lot of knee problems they were having in the 70s when they invented this in the 80s. But cheerleaders it's like $10,000, so a lot of schools weren't buying them. They would just buy them the top mat. So these kids would be on cement, they'd be outside, they'd be on the all-purpose room floor or something. And back in the late 90s, female cheerleading had more injuries than all female sports combined. They were falling from this thing. So think of that idea, how much pain. Think of where they are in their development. We were in Italy last summer, and all of a sudden, it was just a wonderful place. If you cannot go, you should definitely go. It's awesome there. And all of a sudden, one day, I stopped, and I looked at my wife, and I'm like, our 13-year-old voice, I swear it just changed. Like, in the middle of that sentence, I heard his voice change. And then right away, when we got home, he's an athlete too, so we started coming to the gym with me and working out. I'm like, all right, let's listen to his development. He's developing, he's growing, so let's get him stronger as he's growing. And just to understand that they're going through a lot of this when we start talking about, how these different kind of ways of approaching it are going to help with that physiological balance. I want stability and consistency in my physiology, in my nourishment. They call it the rule of threes. And I don't know if you're familiar with this one, but it's a kind of an eating disorder world one. But they say, 3 meals a day, up to 3 snacks. So from a larger body person who's trying to, maybe for health reasons, get smaller bodied, you don't have to have 3 snacks. That's understandable. But for my people that are trying to gain weight, I have them do the rule of threes. You shouldn't go more than 3 or 4 hours without some kind of nourishment. And then, so I call that the rule of threes. And that's what they call it. Everyone calls it. So kind of think of that just as like a rule of thumb. And now you think on a regular day, your kid gets up, they have nourishment, it changes their physiology. Any one of you that has raised a kid would see a crying baby, you gave it some food or you nursed it, and it stopped crying. its emotions changed on a dime. It took just a little bit of time to feed them, and they went from a physiology that brought anguish to a physiology that they would go to. I used to have a slide where it had like a picture of one of my sons crying, and then I used to give my kid the frozen blueberries. I don't know if you ever did that, but they would just dig into that, and then he'd just be like a big giant blueberry. But he would go from crying to happy blueberry kid in 2 seconds. And it was really showed you how much the plate can play out into our emotions. And so keep reminding ourselves, wow, if I do go without eating, that changes my physiology, it changes my insulin. And think of that too. Has anyone seen the movie Milk? It was about Harvey Milk. He was a San Francisco politician, and he was murdered, and so was the mayor. And they were both murdered. The guy went, he planned it out, got his gun, he went to town hall, he found the two of them, he killed them. He was one of the first openly gay politicians, and he was murdered as a hate crime. But he didn't go to jail for murder. Do you know what he went to jail for? Manslaughter. So this man had a plan, got his gun, hunted him down, and they called it manslaughter because his defense attorney said that since he was diabetic and he had a binge episode, that the binge and the hypoglycemia got him psychotic, and that's what fueled it. So they called it the Twinkie defense. And he got manslaughter instead of what most of us think should have been first-degree murder. And so it really shows you how that how we nourish plays out into our emotions, right? So we can see on both sides. On one side, we have hangry, right? Too restricted, not enough, and you're getting angry. And then you can lose it on the other side with binges. And the truth is that, has anyone heard of binge eating before, or binge eating disorder? You know, the number one cause of binge eating, anyone have any idea? Too much restriction earlier in the day. So like we set ourselves up for it. We skip breakfast and things, and we think, well, I'm gonna have less because I skipped this meal, but then you replace a bowl of cereal with a bowl of ice cream later at night because you're starving. And it's not always a bowl. When people have binge eating issues, and I often will ask them, tell me about like when you binge, what that looks like. And sometimes people use slang. They talk about their binges in almost a romantic way. And they would say things like, sometimes Anna and I'd have a little bit of sugar, and that would mean like a couple pieces of chocolate, Hershey's Kisses or something. And I had this one gentleman, he said, well, then usually at the end of the night before bed, I have a little bit of sugar, and then I go to bed. And I'm like, okay, well, what's your sugar? Like thinking he's gonna say Hershey's Kiss, and he's like, I think it's Gold Medallion, which is a bag of refined sugar. And he would just take a spoon to it. And so you really see, like in this way, think of how that's gonna change his internal environment in such a strong way. And then we do the equation, right? Nourishment has changed, emotions have changed, relationships are gonna change. So if I'm restrictive, then I become hangry. And I don't know if you've ever been around someone who's hangry, not as fun. Not nearly as fun, right? And then we can see it on that other side. So with the athlete's plate, and by the way, and Doc can give you my emails and stuff like that, and I can send you some of the stuff. And I can also, because we don't do outpatient, we're higher levels of care, but I can set you up if someone's like, oh, Russ, I need a sports nutritionist. There's a whole bunch that we work with in the area. And you probably know a bunch of people yourself as well. But I always say, like, if you have a kid who's really serious in the sports, you should talk to a sports nutritionist and really have them say, all right, this is what it should look like. Here's game day, here's day off. And really get yourself some kind of plan and give yourself some kind of parameters. The statistics around eating disorders in the athletic population are kind of all over the place. And that's because sports are all over the place. It's hard to compare a cheerleader or a gymnast or a dancer to a basketball player, badminton. I mean, they're all athletes, but they're so different. So the stats are all over the place. But one thing they started recognizing is aesthetic sports, figure skating, gymnastics, cheerleading, believe it or not, equestrian. And they had a significant higher level of eating disorders in equestrians. And you think about it, because what? They're being judged on how they look. It's what they call a socio-evaluative environment. And they can be very dangerous because, again, it's just that deficit-focused environment. In some ways, that evaluation can be very helpful in making you better as an athlete, but it's really how it delivers can really make it different. And so what we find is that a lot of these athletes hit puberty and start to change, and then they take drastic measures to try to stop that change. And aesthetic sports had it much more, and endurance sports, and for boys, weight class derived sports, really big. A lot of gymnasts go into like jiu-jitsu, and I did, and a lot of my buddies would do that, and they would have you weigh in one day and then fight the next day. And then one of my clients actually is in the UFC. He's a UFC fighter. He gets a $50,000 change if he wins or loses. So he really like gets in his head. He fights at 145. What do you think? And he weighs in Friday night. What do you think he weighs when he wakes up Friday morning? He fights at 145. He wakes up at around 160. And he weighs in at 145 at dinner time. And then what do you think he fights at the next day? Back at 160. So what they want to start doing now is having people weigh in right before the fight.
But then they'll be dehydrated.
Well, now, no, but then you'll start to walk the weight that you should be at.
Yeah.
You know? So like I walk at like 160, 155, and then I would fight at 155, 150. So like stayed right in that range, so it was just a little change.
I remember a neighbor having her second grader in a garbage bag to run off because he was such a big boy. She didn't want him playing pee-wee football against bigger kids. 'Cause
Wow.
He was only a second grader. I was like, you gotta be kidding me.
Sports have got a really interesting
Every
place in
time
our...
to make him sweat.
Yeah, that was like an old school kind of
Oh, man.
sweat it off. There's a fight club in Southie that we used to do jiu-jitsu at, and they have a sauna that's just like a box, and it has an exercise bike in it. And they would put on that garbage bag outfit and get in there, and they just destroy themselves and just really run their bodies. So we're kind of finding that we can change the system and we can help these boys a lot. But you'd be amazed the amount of pushback on that boys. But there's just a huge, so what I say is that they're kind of at risk. Now, if we look at how most people are eating in our culture, we'll say like in the outside here is all the healthy eaters, people that just intuitively have a good connection between their physiology, their genetics, their epigenetics. Everything kind of balances. And there's a handful of us that happens to, but a lot of people in Western culture have some versions of disordered eating that are just kind of messed up eating. People that skipping meals and stuff like that, but it's not going to bring them to my clinic. It's almost like alcohol. Some people might have some behaviors that you're like, dude, that's not the healthiest behavior, but they still go to work on Monday morning. So you're like, okay, then maybe they don't need AA, but it's kind of a messed up behavior. And there's a lot of, I don't know if you've ever talked to your friends or have friends who are on a different diet each week. And back in the early 2000s, there was this phase where there were these health documentaries all over the place that were coming out. And I was in one of them. My wife was in one. It was called Fat, Sick, and Nearly Dead. And it was it was on Netflix. And then they had a sequel, and I was in the sequel. And we would talk a lot about it, and they would go through like New York City, and they'd go to Times Square, and they just started interviewing people and asking them, have you been on any diets? And just the slew of diets people were on, from like the hot dog diet. I have 4 hot dogs in the morning and 3 at night. They had these regimes, and I can't eat anything that casts a shadow, or they just, or vegan, or they just have these strict rules. There's just so many, and some of it I think is very disordered, but it's not really gonna bring us into some of these more classical eating disorders. Now, a lot of you have heard anorexia. Orexia, is the Greek word for appetite. An is without. So without appetite, that's what the word anorexia means. And again, there are some evolutionary biologists that talk about this disorder and saying that in some situations it could be a benefit. And so that's why we would see that there would be genes for this. So anorexia has a very strong genetic link. And we could talk about it on another lecture because it's pretty cool stuff. But that being said, it still manifests differently. So we do have types of people with anorexia who are what you're thinking in your mind, people that don't like to eat, people that will over-exercise, very obsessed with getting smaller and smaller and smaller. But there is a type of anorexia called binge purge type. So we do have people who have that desire to get smaller, trying to get smaller, go through restriction, and then that restriction gets them to binge. And then the binge gets them guilt, shame, And then that emotion pushes them to behaviors. And you all know a slew of behaviors people do. Purging is a common behavior. People would eval with me talking about purging that they have been purging for decades. I worked with some ballet dancers in the Boston Ballet. When I talked about some of these disorders, they laughed and they said, that's just commonplace in the Boston Ballet. That's like everybody. So it's really changed a lot. And so right now I see a lot of people with anorexia, but now anorexia has a couple little offshoots. One of the offshoots is orthorexia. Ortho meaning straight, like orthodontist, straight child. And those are the people that are like, I can't have anything with high fructose corn syrup in it. I need to have this many grams of protein, this many, and they get very, very strict. And it's someone's birthday, and they're like, I had a guy whose son said, hey, Dad, we just went trick-or-treating. Let's have some candy together. And he was like, sorry, kid. Not one piece of candy. That's the right face. Like, you feel for that poor kid, right? But you're like, come on, buddy. But that's, for me, that's when we realize that this disordered eating is a disorder. Because that's messing with one of your relationships now, and you're not even recognizing it. RFID is a newer eating disorder. It's avoidant restrictive food intake disorder. And so I get this with a lot of the special needs kids I work with, or kids that are on autistic spectrum or with intellectual or developmental disabilities, where maybe you've seen the kid with like the earphones because sound is a little bit difficult for them. A lot of the kids I get have sensory issues, but not with sound, with aspects of eating. So the sensations of digestion, the sensations of a full belly, sensations of swallowing. And they'll have, in the same way that the kid, the sound is overwhelming, for them, those sensations are overwhelming. So they have a type of anorexia, but they're not trying to get smaller. They don't care about that. They just don't like that texture of that food, so they can't eat it because of how it feels. So, and then I'm the only one doing it, I think, in the country right now, but people with intellectual disabilities and developmental disabilities are just rampant with eating disorders.
Do you think this relationship to paving down the road, instead of like keeping the kid in the coach, we're getting the road nice and smooth?
Yeah, and that's...
Do you think that has anything to do with that?
I think there's a piece of it, because I think, because intellectual and developmental disabilities has really just increased drastically over the past couple of generations. So I do feel there's something that's environmental, but I think at the same time, how we're treating these kids behaviorally might reinforce these behaviors. And that's what happens with a lot of it. So the kid says they don't want to eat it, the parent's like, then don't eat it. And then they start realizing their kid's eating fewer and fewer variety of foods. And that's another thing too, I want variety. And also the microbiome, the bacteria and the microlife that lives in my belly, all over me, has a huge say in my size and shape. There was that other study they found, I don't know if you've read any of this stuff, it's brilliant, but metabolism is really linked to that bacteria. So kids that are C-sections have different versions of it. They think that's where a lot of food allergies came from as well. So a lot of these issues we've seen are happening because I think there's a change in the environment as well. And then this is a newer diagnosis, right? Anorexia athletica, which is what we see with a lot of athletes who kind of, that kid that has the 8-pack abs, and some kids, they're just going to run that way. But it's a real small percentage of kids that run that way. But then there's the kids who go through drastic behaviors to run that way. And those are the kids that really kind of mess themselves up. And just like I said with drinking, these behaviors can spill over into other aspects of their life and really make things difficult. And so you start seeing these kids have a lot of different issues with what they do. That's the same kind of thing. Pica, has anyone heard of pica? Well, of course you have, but it's like named after, I think it was the magpie, but it was this bird that eats like everything. And that's a disorder where young kids eating things that you wouldn't expect. But when we look at sports, we can see that there's different aspects of sports. Even the way they talk about bodies in sports. In cheerleading, they have a flyer. That's the girl that gets thrown in the air. Usually, almost all the time, it's a girl. But then she hits puberty, gains a little bit of weight, and they say, you can't be a flyer anymore. And it breaks the kid's heart. And a lot of the kid's identity was built into being that flyer. So that kind of criticism is, you can't be a flyer anymore, you gained weight. And what does that kid do? I work so hard to be a flyer. You don't think I can't work hard to lose weight? And they'll show you. It's like you just threw the gauntlet down on there. And then the other thing we should talk about at some point too is just some of the uniforms. You know, a lot of hypersexualized and very revealing in ways. Like look at a guy's volleyball, beach volleyball. Look at a girl's beach volleyball. You know, very, very different but they're doing the exact same thing. You know, men's gymnastics, I guess it's hard to say gymnastics because that's Greek for naked exercise. So it is very body focused, you know, but I do think, you know, we should talk about that.
Does
And
the same thing apply to like crew, like with a boxing or something?
yeah, because they found a lot, because that's the person that's supposed to be shorter and smaller. And again, once I start to make my size and shape something that's going to reflect on my team, it really increases the pressure on me to behave in a way that's going to enforce that. So if I say, listen, we can't have a good flyer anymore because you're gaining weight, well, I'm going to lose weight because it's not just about me being a flyer. It's about my 20 best friends on this floor that I don't want to let them down. And our young women are so social, and they can read social messages so much better than our young boys, which is, I think, one of the reasons that we see more young women falling prone to eating disorders.
Is that the coach's message as you come together, they have to pick who's going to be doing what? Is that the coach's message?
Coaches will choose that, yeah.
They look at you and say, well, you'd be perfect for this.
I hate to say it, Dot, but I've witnessed it. A new kid would come into the gym, and the coaches would say, "Oh, well, she's a flyer. Oh, well, look at her size. She's a base." They didn't even talk to her, but just from looking at her.
Indirect message.
But by the way, what if we saw an 8th grader who was 6'2"? We'd all be talking basketball, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So like we do it in so many ways, and that's actually nothing personal against basketball, but I think, you know, right now when we talk about fairness in sports, and that's been a huge discussion with like the trans world and fairness in sports, and I say I totally agree with having a fair playing field, but if boxing and wrestling and judo have weight classes, so just the biggest person isn't squashing everybody, why doesn't basketball have height classes? You know, I did a lecture at Assumption College, and we were talking about WNBA, and one of my kids did a presentation, and it said that it was like 4 or 5 years ago, the #1 draft pick for the NBA. By the way, why is it the National Basketball League and the women's? Why isn't it the men's basketball league and the women's basketball league? Like, why is it basketball league and then women?
It's the NHL or it's the WNHL.
Which is interesting, right? Do we do that with soccer too? So I just think it's just very interesting. But they said the #1 draft pick got $6 million a year contract as a man. And it is ridiculous. I agree with that. Guess how much the #1 draft pick for the WNBA got? How much?
A couple $100,000.
You're so generous.
30 or 40,000.
50.
50?
So think about that. The #1 basketball player that was born with 2 X chromosomes is going to make such a small percentage compared to what a guy would make. And so for me, and if I'm sure,
They're fighting that now too, though, aren't they? Like the girls' soccer league.
they've done phenomenally well with making that progress.
They really had to fight.
Exactly. Why do
Where they were the world champions, and then guys didn't even make it to world champions and to the World Cup. And so yeah, we could definitely jump down that road big time. But what we started recognizing is that we started to focus more on someone's size and shape than their talents and skills or their effort. So like in judo and wrestling, they'll say, we want to take size out of the equation, so we'll put 2 people the same size and shape together in this contest because we want to see whose technique is better. We want to see whose strategy is better or their tactics are better. And that, I think, is what we like about the athletic experience, you know? So like, is it really that surprised when someone is 8 foot tall that they can dunk? Like, should we really be that impressed? For me, I think it should be more about the skill level. And then again, we have such a small amount of people. There's like 1,000 professional basketball players. There's about 30,000 college basketball players. There's about a million if you had boys and girls together, high school basketball players. So we could really see that these are vehicles not to become a pro. You know, there are other reasons that we have to be doing this. And so I do think it would be better for us to start changing how we do that. But when we look in the research, dancers, figure skaters, a lot of elite athletes, and it was Western culture. It wasn't just the U.S. culture. It was Western culture. And you can see how a good trait for an athlete can run awry in an eating situation, and now you start getting people in trouble. And I'm amazed how many young women will lose their period and not think twice about it. Well, that's funny. I used to have a period. I just stopped having it. What are you going to do? And they just move on in life, and they don't think that's a sign that there's a problem. I tell the parents and their kids of young women, I say that period is like the canary in the coal mine. Once that stops, it's your body's way of saying not enough. You are not getting enough. I don't care if you are not hungry, if you don't feel hungry or whatever, it's not enough. And it's a quite common situation. And we know that that can lead to fertility issues down the road. It can lead to bone issues down the road, mental health issues down the road. And the other thing is I have a lot of runners who come to our clinic because they can't run anymore because they're on leave because of stress fractures. So they don't give themselves enough nourishment to recoup from the really difficult training that they do and that kind of pounding. And I have a lot of kids who don't drink enough. They're afraid of liquid calories, so they'll only drink water because they're always calorie counting. And they'll have orthostatic hypertension, so they go from sitting to standing and they get dizzy and want to fall over. And we've probably seen that. It's happened to us at times. And that this will be like a constant state of life. Sometimes they'll have low blood pressure but high pulse. Sometimes everything just drops low. And a lot of them just don't really see it. They have body dysmorphia. You know, it takes energy from me to go and use my brain to look in a mirror and then to file what I see in that part of my brain that is my self-image. You know, like in social media where you have your ID picture, or what do they call that? Profile picture, thank you, the appropriate person. You know, your brain has that too. But for a lot of them, they are so calorically and energy depleted that they don't even have enough kind of brain energy that their brain is going to update their image. So they'll look like this in real life, but this is their memory, or this is how they see themselves. And they've done study after study after study that show that their brains just really start to dysfunction in that area, and they start to see something very different. And so when they see things distorted, they act according to how they feel on those things. And then we see them do a lot of things too. Laxatives and diet pills are another just really popular thing that I'm amazed how many kids do. And it's just really not helpful, really not healthy going down. So we created a program, and now we're creating, we also have a program that we're creating for adolescents, and this is for adults. Right now, I've got a couple of Olympians. I have a couple of pro athletes. I've got like a pro mountain biker. I didn't even know that was pro, but it's pro. I've had a pro surfer once. Gymnast cheerleaders are pretty common in the eating disorder world. Right now, I have a lot of runners. Again, that's another one that we get. And so what we really try to do is just get them in a program where we get them with a nutritionist, get them on a meal plan, kind of like what we're talking there, and then kind of help them with problem solving and getting that done, getting them the support they need to kind of get that done. And it's a higher level of care, so it's a pretty significant amount of time that they come in with us. But when they need us bad. Usually this is a kid who hasn't had a period in a while. It's a kid who's been losing weight significantly and fast, and a good amount of it in a short amount of time. And they're doing this in a time of their development that I really don't want it to hinder their growth and their development. And a lot of us know that a lot of our hormones, our sex hormones like estrogen, are fat-soluble hormones. So when I carry less fat on me, I'll also carry less estrogen on me. So that's part of the reason that they lose their periods, because they don't even have enough estrogen, right, to make fertile. And so we have sports psychologists, and we have nutritionists, and kind of like this whole team approach to kind of helping them learn how to fuel for themselves. And fueling for an athlete is different than fueling for a non-athlete. And really trying to get them to a competent place where they can navigate their lives. I can't tell you how many of the people in my clinics can't go out to eat, like anywhere. That's what we do as Americans, You can't stop going out to eat. It's like a few other things that we all kind of agree on. So we want to make them more competent in the process of getting themselves to eat day in, day out. And also I want to start, there is this issue with like body shaming and body size having so much meaning, and knowing that it's very little of our actual effort really goes into our adult body size. It doesn't really change it super much. We all, again, Planet Fitness and all these other, Noom and stuff are going to say like you can really change, but in general, most Americans don't change super much in their adult years. It's just not common. But we all have this idea. And I also want to ask you, if you looked at the early 1900s, the early Olympics, all the Olympians had one body type, and you might remember this name. It was called a mesomorph or a mesomorph. They had ectomorphs, endomorphs, esomorphs. Do you guys remember that stuff? I don't know if they still use that kind of terminology. I don't think they do. But everyone was kind of that mesomorph. They said every sport was, for the men, was a guy who was 6 feet tall and weighed, 170 to 190 pounds or something. The basketball players, gymnasts, everyone. And then over the years, you started seeing this evolution. And they saw, gymnasts get smaller, basketball players get taller. They started seeing that certain body shapes and sizes would be better for certain sports or have an advantage. Has anyone read that book, The Sports Gene by Epstein? Really cool book. But he talks a lot about it in here. And I think that kind of body esteem kind of started saying, we started judging athletes on that size and shape. And I think that doesn't do our kids too well because there's not that many of us look what we want it to in our heads. And so it's a boring slide, so I'll finish with there. And then my family's Irish. Middlebuicus means 1,000 thanks in Irish. But, I appreciate you coming in on a night. I can see it's already pretty late. But, this is something I think goes under the radar. A lot of coaches are going to praise the kid who comes in with an 8-pack abs. But they have no idea what the kid went through to get to that 8-pack abs. And how does he know that the kid didn't eat for 2 days to get that? Or kids taking laxatives or diet pills. We had one kid leave program. The programs in our clinics are like partial hospitalizations. So it's like going to school. You go in there at 8:30, you leave at 2:30. We had a kid leave at 2:30, walk home, and then just kept walking. Kept walking until they walked back to program at 8:30. Walked the entire night. Kept walking until it was time to come back. So just think about this, where they're going. So again, when nourishment is off, you don't think straight. The other thing that's kind of scary is that nourishment has been linked to thoughts of injury and suicidality. So if you don't have enough calories, if you don't have enough omega-3 fatty acid, if you don't have enough of cholesterol, all three have been linked to increased suicidality. Interestingly, they found that the water supplies of towns that have more lithium than the other water supplies have less suicide, less violent crime. So if we'll put chloride in water for cavities, maybe we should be putting a little lithium in everyone's water to kind of make it happier. But I want you to kind of recognize your kid as an individual and understand that their sport and where they are in their development is going to play out to how they see themselves in their world. But when they get to the place where they're coming to my clinic, they're in a bad place. So we get suicide attempts. We get suicide completions. We get cutters. Cutting is something that is just increased like you don't even know. We have kids that will cut in the clinic. Think of how impulsive you would be that you think I'll just find a corner.
No, I can't restrict, so I got to cut.
100%. And then even I have kids who will vomit down their shirts just because they don't want anyone to see. They are so good at lying. They're like people with substance issues. No, I just had to go to the bathroom. Oh, that food kind of hit my stomach wrong. No, they're in there throwing up. These kids are so good at throwing up because they practice so much. I personally hate throwing up. I don't know about the rest of you. I hate the whole process of it. I hate that pre-time. You're like, oh, it's coming. It's coming. I hate that. I'm like, I know it's coming. I cannot stop this train. It's coming. But a lot of the kids I work with don't have that issue. I was raised the smaller bodied person in a larger bodied family. Everyone else in my family was, at one point of their life, or most of their lives, larger bodied or obese, what we would say back in the day. And I thought, they used to say, oh, it's because you were a gymnast. But I think it was all backwards. I was a gymnast because I was small. I wasn't small because I was a gymnast. And then when I did some research on it, when I was in grad school, I did some papers to kind of find out why my brother and sisters look so different from me in size and shape. And I investigated. My mother had gestational diabetes for all of them but me. So right out of the gate, I was born at 7 pounds. They were born at 10. So right out of the gate, what was that?
The oldest?
Second. Yeah, I thought that was strange too. Because I think they have different things in birth
Usually
order.
if you have gestational diabetes, you're gonna have it.
For everyone, yeah. So I have for my older brother, and yeah, well, there's also my mom's memory, which is a little bit right nowadays. So, but the idea, and I started realizing that too. And so it's at an early age, what a different experience I had in my world with my body. Think of how different it was for me to learn movement as a young child. Think of the confidence that I gained with my abilities with movement just because of how my gestation played out, you know? I was eating the same thing my brother was eating. So it really kind of shows you that, like a lot of people that can manage and navigate nourishment, it's the luck of the draw. There's a lot of stars had to align for you to be as lucky as you are. For most of us, there's going to be some kind of things that we have to learn how to navigate. And for some of us, it might be aspects of size and shape, or some of us, it's aspects of like what we're actually eating, the quality of what we're eating, and how that's playing out to our longevity. But in general, when I talk to you guys today, it's understanding that our kids are navigating some really difficult waters here. They navigate social media where 24/7 they can be bullied at any time. Someone can be commenting on them. And how many filters they have? Think about it. And I'll work with an athlete on a tumbling pass. She takes 5 minutes before she goes to set up her camera. And then after she goes right back to look at it, to run it through a filter, and then to post it. And then every other turn she goes up and comes back and tells me how many likes she got. That's dizzying. I'm exhausted just thinking of her world, how she can get up.
But her confidence is not going to be based on her skill level. It's going to be based on her number of likes.
Think about that. And I think she even knows how fallacious that is of an idea, that it's actually making her feel more confident, because it's not. It's shadow. It's not substance. You know, so I think that's one of the things that I think we're gonna learn that, you know, we were so worried about our kids drinking and smoking, and that social media was probably more dangerous than any of that, and we just kind of watched it come upon us like it was nothing. So right now they're saying, you know, probably wait till like high school for social media as the earliest. But for
The healthiest kids give it up.
I gave it up. I was like, well, I had to go off it because my clients and patients would find me.
Oh, yeah.
And
Never been off it.
I learned that on Facebook, if someone looks you up, then they'll tell you, like, hey, here's a friend suggestion.
Right.
And that's someone who looked you up. So I'll be like, I can't believe this person is a friend suggestion. I just did an evaluation with them 2 days ago. How did they know? Like, Mark Zuckerberg, you're crazy. But it was because she looked me up. And so I was like, oh, I got to stop posting things.
If I go type someone's name, and they get my picture.
Yes, then you'll be, so it's just scary. And I also think it didn't come with instructions. Like, we need a rule book for it. Mm-hmm. And as we're all learning, it's not really helping society that much. Well, thank you for coming.